Well, thank you, President Krause, for that generous introduction. And now my job is to try to live up to it. So good luck to me. I also thank you not only for the honor of having me give this year's commencement address, but also for patiently guiding me in figuring out the many duties and responsibilities the deanship involves this past year. Being dean is something that they don't teach in seminary or in graduate school, but unlike many deans out there, I had someone with 13 years of experience to guide me. Let me also thank the administration, the wonderful faculty, and our wonderful students for being such wonderful and patient colleagues and co-learners as I learned the ropes of the dean's position. And I know I do this all the time, but the work of running a seminary is not possible without the amazing staff. Yes, yeah. Staff like Dean Julie Jennings, who introduced many of you to Eden and counseled you as you encountered challenges through your programs, and Registrar Jessica Hansis, who was always monitoring your academic progress, and in a few cases, helped you cross the finish line. And of course, there are the executive administrators, members of the tech team, home team, who did so much to make Eden a singular and unique community. Now, I would love to name every one of them right now, but I am very much aware that I am standing in between you and your diploma. And I am very sure, since I'm reading your names, by the time we're done with commencement, you will be sick of hearing my voice. So I will assure you that I will not take my sweet time. It is good to join faculty, administrators, trustees, staff, and alumni, and with family and friends to celebrate our graduates tonight. For many of them, the journey to this day has been long and arduous. Some of them traveled from afar, leaving their families at home just to study here. Others balanced school with life's difficulties. And throughout this time, there must have been some moments when they wondered if they were supposed to be here. Certainly, some students left before they completed their programs, and I don't blame them. Studying ministry, Bible, and theology is difficult. I remember when I went to seminary in 2010. There were many times when I thought I got my calling mixed up. I had no idea what a hypostatic union is or what apokatastasis is all about. I took theology for the first time like many of you have in seminary. But unlike Dr. Niles, who actually explains her terms, my systematic theology professor didn't explain anything. And later I found out almost everyone majored theology in college and came straight to my seminary. And so the professor assumed that and started at level 10 and not at level 1. My first theology paper was a 7-page paper on Gregory of Nyssa. I spent 3 weeks on it. I read his Life of Moses over and over, wrote 3 drafts of the paper. I used the writing center. I even learned Chicago-style citations. I got a C-. For the TA, my C- was because the thesis was too simple, not complex enough. Now, she tried to be pastoral by adding a comment at the end. I know you can do it. But I was deflated, and I was so sure I am missing my calling. Now, when I graduated 3 years later, I found that I was not alone. So many other friends also were questioning their callings, wondering whether they were in the wrong place. So tonight, I'd like to ask this question. Why do we put ourselves through this? Why are we involved in theological education? In 1970, Thanks. In 1977, Pope Paul VI appointed Oscar Romero to be Archbishop of San Salvador, in a time when church and government relations were rocky in the country. He was chosen precisely because it was thought that a bishop like him would not stir the pot, that he would be a quiet scholar in the archbishop's office and would not make the church a target for the right-wing CIA-backed government. The government, in turn, was only too delighted for someone who was more comfortable in the library than the pulpit to lead the church. A quiet and self-absorbed pastor or church will not pay attention to injustices carried out in their backyard. And yet, against all imaginations, Romero would not only become any liberation theologian, but one of the most powerful voices for the poor and suffering in El Salvador. And he would become one of a few liberation theologians who was martyred for defending the poor against the oppression of injustice and the government that caused it. Last year was the 45th anniversary of his martyrdom. Now, how did Romero turn from a forgettable bishop to a saint? Well, he experienced theological education. But this was not an education that he got when he went to the prestigious Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome to study for his master's. Now, don't get me wrong, Romero was an excellent student in theology. Some of the world's foremost biblical and theological scholars in the Roman Catholic Church went to the Gregorian. And I am also not saying that the study of theology or history is useless. Anyone who is thinking about whether theology or history is useless or not only needs to look at the theological and historical revisions that are happening in our country right now by Christian leaders connected to power. Throughout history, the first step in rewiring a country's sense of good and evil is not to oppress them with an army, although it helps. It begins with revising its histories. So what Romero learned at the Gregorian was not the problem. The second part of his theological education came when he was first appointed the Bishop of Santiago de Maria. This is an impoverished region of El Salvador that was often a target of government raids against communism. There, he could not be insulated from the sufferings of the people. And he discovered that teaching the people the perichoretic trinity, or the transubstantiality of the Eucharistic elements into the body and blood of Christ, was all abstract to a people who had to bear the burden of staring at crushing poverty and the ends of US-made machine guns week after week after week. The theology, the history, the biblical studies he learned at the Gregorian University meant little if he could not bring it into conversation with the lives, the struggles, and the concerns of the people who he ministered to. He was starting to recognize that the church needs to not just talk about salvation, but have a vision for salvation. And that means it must be allies to those who are suffering and dispossessed. On March 12, 1977, only 3 weeks after he became Archbishop, his close friend Rutilio Grande was killed on his way to Mass for his work with the poor. When he went to pick up his body, Romero finally understood. In a Mass at the San Salvador Cathedral the Sunday after, he publicly committed himself and the Catholic Church in El Salvador to accompany the poor and the oppressed. Now, I'm telling you Romero's story because for me, he is an example of why theological education matters, why we are in it for this. We are living in a time when theological education, and more broadly, education in the humanities, is seen as unnecessary. Throughout our countries, universities are shutting down religion and history departments because students are not majoring in them. And because we're trained to think like good capitalists, students want to major in fields that promise high incomes. When I was in college, that was computer science, finance, accounting, actuarial science, and different engineering fields. And in the past year or two, we are seeing AI take those jobs away. And many are having trouble reskilling for a different economy. So now, we are living in a society where the fields of study that are necessary for a democratic and free country, that are necessary for making the case for justice in society, the humanities, are being defunded and understudied, and the jobs that are supposed to pay well are now being taken away by software programming and greedy corporations. And because our country is so woefully impoverished in its moral and theological imaginations, so unable to think globally and collaboratively with partners around the world, all we can do is rage and lament, knowing that we are in a terrible situation but not understanding why, knowing that we need help and we need solutions, but not sure of whom to ask or to even trust. Theological education, in many ways, trains us for the times we are living in now. It is not about making God or our callings easy. And I say this because a common misconception about what we do here in seminary is to tell you how to church properly. Churches are obsessed with churching properly. We have a firm and unchangeable way of understanding what church should be like, what holiness should look like, what right doctrine must sound like, what good behavior is in the church, or what kids should behave like, what flowers to use this Sunday, or where the pulpit should be placed. And seminary is supposed to reinforce that in a lot of people's imagination. But this vision of theological education is impoverished. It is obsessed with control, obsessed with getting things right, obsessed with conformity, with keeping things the way we are because that's the way we've always done it. Some of you have heard this often. In this framing, theological education is not about letting God speak, but about gatekeeping God speak, about gatekeeping theology. It's about ensuring that what we say about God fulfills certain criteria, maybe with a complementary token minority or non-US voice being a nice cherry on top. As Willie James Jennings of Yale University puts it, Western education is designed with a forced affection, shaped to take all of us on a journey of cultural addition, to add to the great European masters other thinkers who are not white or male, but who approximate them. Add to the eternal wisdom and universal insights of Europe the wisdom of other peoples that resemble them. Add this non-white other as embroidery to frame a picture or spices to season a dish. Such a vision of theological education is about fear. The fear of getting things wrong, the fear of messing up, the fear that we will miss out, the fear of blessings withheld. It is such fears that lead too many into misplacing salvation in authoritarian figures who deliver oppression wrapped in salvation's marketing language. Of course, the lack of a decent humanities education means that many cannot tell the difference. Real theological education is not easy because it is about questioning and confronting these fears. If we want to be drawn into God's global work, to be drawn into how God so loved the world, to imagine our churches as being places of welcome, embrace, and refuge without preconditions, then it is critical to deconstruct our faith, to see that our faith has a history, not all of it beautiful and sweet, and to see that God nonetheless has worked in different and powerful ways outside of contexts we are familiar with. In God's world, the USA is not at the center. Many of us are good Americans and are trained to be proficient in empire, and so we'd like to think that we are the center of the world, and sometimes we act like it. The deconstruction that is a part of theological education is important so that we can learn to let go, or at least not hold on so tightly, our love of empire, our love of control, our love of churching, our love of thinking that we know how God should church the rest of the world. It is when we let go of those misplaced loves that we realize that what we have assumed to be fear of the Lord was really the fear of letting God work God's way. It's really the fear of the Spirit doing something new, or the fear of an interpretation of the Scriptures that leads us to rethink our assumptions behind our faith. It is when we release these fears and open ourselves to faith in a God who is the ground of wisdom that we can confidently reconstruct our theology, not only so that it is critical in our ministry context, but also so that we can minister effectively in a world where the majority of Christian voices don't speak English and don't think American. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It takes a lot of work on your end, and it also takes a lot of work on our end as teachers. But it is so important because as Christians, we do have the good news. God is still with us. God is still speaking. God still desires justice for our world. And God's table is still larger and more bountiful than our imaginations allow. And if we take our eyes off social media for more than a minute, perhaps we can see that there are prophets still among us doing God's work, many of whom we may not know. Prophets like Gione Havea, Peter Crishley, Jenny Tepa Daniel, Dario Barulin. These prophets remind us that God's world is so much bigger and contains so much wisdom beyond our Western sensibilities. We can imagine new ways of thriving that do not require hoarding resources, but sharing them. We can imagine new ways of relating to our neighbors, to strangers, to other institutions, to creation that are not merely transactional, not merely about profit. Theological education reminds us that a greater world is out there, that we are not alone, and a world of greater justice and love, even in this time, is still possible. Theological education allows us to have a more daring, more expansive theological imagination. That was what allowed Romero to expand his ministry beyond the Archbishop's palace in San Salvador. God does not only meet humanity within the four walls of the church. God is already at work, speaking words of freedom and justice through the people. What we need is to simply recognize the church needs to listen where God is still speaking, and to have the imagination and the courage to respond to God and say, "Here am I." And that imagination, that courage, is what our world is missing. To our graduates, our confidence as faculty is that you are equipped with enough wisdom to have that imagination. Some of you have challenged us to imagine differently and daringly in our own classes, calling out where we have fallen short. We are indeed a learning community. What you learned at Eden is not the end, but the beginning of a lifetime of learning, of imagining a different world. You were our students, but now you are our colleagues in this task of theological imagination. And together, we continue Eden's tradition of fostering communities of prophetic imaginations. The world is a difficult place right now where the scoffers are seen as wise, the wicked are seen as righteous, and it costs dearly to call truth to their deceptions. Yet, so many people are hungry for the prophetic word, for a light that shines in the many darknesses in our communities, for the expansive table that wisdom provides. We have our work cut out for us. That work began before you came to Eden, and I assure you that work will continue after today is over. Last night, when the faculty shared their blessings at senior banquet, I did not share my blessings. That's because I'm doing it tonight. And what is my blessing and my hope for all of you? My inspiration comes from the theologian Ignacio Ellacuría, who was dean of the University of Central America in San Salvador, was actively engaged in justice work against the right-wing government, and he himself would be martyred a decade later after Romero. When Romero was first announced to be Archbishop of San Salvador, Ellacuría was not particularly impressed. In a reflection on the early Romero, Ellacuría simply called him a good priest. He checked the boxes, he did what needed to be done, but nothing more. A good, but certainly not a prophetic priest. A priest without much of a theological imagination. But as Romero developed into a champion of the Salvadoran people and was martyred for that, Ellacuría remarked that God came through El Salvador in Romero. So my blessing and my hope for all of you, and think about this as you receive your diplomas very shortly, is that when people experience your leadership, your prophetic ministry, the fruits of your theological education here at Eden, the wisdom you have developed and continue to develop, when they experience it, my hope and prayer is that they will say, while you were here at church, while you were here in our organization, while you were here in the streets, while you were here organizing for justice, God came through here in you. God came through our neighborhood in you. God came through our city in you. God came through the United States, Kenya, Tanzania, India in you. God came through here in you. Congratulations and God bless.